Welcome back, friends, to another episode of the Nexus podcast, where we discuss key financial fundamentals, including the importance of engaging with a financial advisor and how to understand your finances today so that you can prepare adequately for a financially healthy retirement. A huge thank you to our corporate sponsors, Dovi Feldman at Feldview and Alex Haffner at Fusion Funding. Enjoy this week's episode. Arnold, thank you so much for coming in today. I appreciate it. You were very willing to give over your time, which I'm very grateful for.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem. So doing some research, come across quite an extensive title. Private pilot, photographer, cyclist, specialist financial advisor, worldwide finance award winner, and inheritance, tax and investment specialist. Your title tells quite a story, and I would love to hear it.
First thing is, I haven't done cycling for some time, I should confess. Well, that's a good inspiration you've just given me to get back on the road. So that's a good start. So I suppose I'll start off by saying what I do for those who don't know me. So professionally, I act as a financial advisor. And in this country, a financial advisor can mean a great many things. So generally speaking, a financial advisor helps clients with financial planning, which again is not necessarily the most explanatory term as to what that means. But essentially, my expertise is helping clients with investments. I advise on regulated investment vehicles that will aim to give clients a good return over the long term so that they get growth on their money. And alongside that, a very big part of what I do is bringing down their tax exposure. So it's not just about investing to get a good return. It's about what strategies can we put in place, what investments can we put in place to reduce a client's tax liability. So, for example, at the upper end, or when I say upper end, I mean, let's say older clients for 75, 80 and above. A very big part of what I do, which is in the strapline of my business description, if you like, is inheritance tax planning. So I help clients, older clients, with putting investments in place into vehicles that will protect their investment from inheritance tax or protect their assets from inheritance tax. It's not just a case of getting a good return on their investment, but what tax can I save my client? Cascading down to the younger clients, it will be reducing their income tax exposure. For company directors, it would also be, can we reduce corporation tax through pensions, which I'm sure we'll dig into a little bit more. So essentially, my expertise is advising clients where to put their money, and I advise and facilitate and implement these investments for them, all of which are through regulated investment vehicles. I'm not getting involved in anything that is unregulated or anything that's, private investment or anything like that. That's just, some Joe blogs around the corner. Everything we do is regulated and covered under the FCA. So essentially, I'm advising older clients, I'm advising company directors especially, I'm advising individuals to enhance their financial future. And a big part of that nowadays is something known as cash flow planning, where we can project forward whether a client is on track for whatever their financial goals are. So for someone, it may be, right, when can I retire? Have I got enough provision? Am I putting enough provision in place to ensure that I can retire when I want to retire, whatever age that might be, and will I have enough to do to fulfill my financial goals? For others, it may be those, let's say, that have investments, that they're living off their investments and they're not sort of in the workforce directly. It would be, well, have I got enough assets? Am I generating enough income? And am I on track in that regard? So cash flow planning is also a very big part of what we do nowadays.
Okay, so there's a lot to discuss within this space, and we're going to get to the different services and the different options available. To get started, for a young business owner, say late 20s, early 30s perhaps, what are the basic fundamentals that you can share when it comes to how we should be approaching this topic?
Ooh, that's a very wide-ranging question. I would say it's important when you're in a position, obviously when a person's starting a business or even anyone starting out in their career, whether they're a lawyer or an accountant or on PAYE, whenever they are starting out, the initial years, especially when they graduate or when they start a business, are difficult. They're looking at the initial stages to cover their costs and break even. Once they get past that stage and they're earning more than what their outgoings are, so they've got surplus income, that is the time to start planting the seeds, albeit those seeds might be quite humble. But it's very, very important that a person starts to put away surplus income somewhere. The net is far and wide as to where their money should go, but it's important that they start planting seeds for the future, because if they don't come across, people that said, oh, I'll start saving next year, I'll start planting the seeds next year. And next year never comes for whatever reason, and they may have, long spanning careers where they're earning very well. I've seen some horror stories where they earned well during their career, and at the end of it, they had very little to show for it. I was recently introduced to a client who was, earning, he worked for an investment bank. So he's in the investing world on the corporate side. He was earning around £300,000 a year. And he had been on this sort of very, very respectable salary for a number of years. And I thought, let's sit down and see what we can do to bring your tax bill down or to set you on the path of investing efficiently for the future. And after doing what we call a fact find, sitting down and getting to know him, he had literally £10,000 in savings. I was gobsmacked. And he had been, on this salary for a long, long time. So sometimes you do come across people that burn more than they earn. Yeah, it does happen. And we're all humans. So anyone can fall prey.
I wasn't going to get into this so much, but you've raised it with that story. People's lifestyles tend to expand very much with their incomes. If they're not on top of it, to make sure they've got a goal and a plan in place, by default, they're going to start just increasing their lifestyle, increasing their spending habits, and end up losing a lifetime of potential investing.
It will be spend, keep up with the Joneses, as it were. I'm not sure keep up with the Goldmans. And it can happen. And a person sometimes really needs to be engaged to understand. And that's where I help clients with cash flow planning, that we can project forward what provision they've got. And if they don't, we can illustrate, if you do follow the strategies that we're trying to embark upon, what the situation will look like 10, 20, 30 years down the road, and what the alternative is if you don't.
And nothing's more encouraging for them to see that roadmap and say, let's get on
absolutely.
This, let's get
on
on
the
this
other
journey.
hand, I was introduced by another client to a very successful plumber who's got his own business, and he's relatively young with young children, and he's now in a position where he's building up excess funds in his limited company. And he was proactive, and he was very excited when I was introduced to him. He said, what should I be doing? I'm building up this money and I know I need to do something. And he was very shrewd with his spending. I've met him and his wife, met them together. And they're very shrewd with their spending, and they're very aware that they need to do something and not just leave their funds in his business to build up. So that's the other end of the spectrum, as it were, where you've got clients that need advice. They know they need to do something, but they obviously need somebody to provide that professional guiding hand.
That's amazing. You've really touched on what I was going to ask you next, was that we're very much encouraged to learn a trade, get out there, try and make a respectable income, feed your family, but we're not very well educated as to what to do with the money once we've earned it. Like you're saying, if they're not going to be intentional, they're really going to lose out in the long term.
Yeah, they'll lose out. I mean, I'll just jump in here. Firstly, if you leave money in the bank, you'll get a very low return. Historically, interest rates have been certainly low for the last 15 years or so, although inflation has increased of late, and albeit the interest rates were rising a year or two ago, they're possibly on a downward trajectory. I think the inflation rose a little bit in the news this morning. But generally speaking, if one leaves funds on deposit in a bank account, that money will lose value over time. So while it's always important, very important, and I would stress this, to have an emergency fund on deposit in a bank account or in a cash ISA, one shouldn't overload the boat and sit on too much cash, because that is wasteful in the long run.
It's costing you for it to sit there.
And again, this is where I help clients to find that balance, right? How much is a sensible emergency rainy day fund that you leave in the bank that you know you can sleep at night? For some of my older clients where I'm doing inheritance tax planning, that figure is around 100,000. I do run this exercise with clients. Right. I say to them, I'm going to ask you a question, and I say, what amount of money do you want on deposit that will allow you to sleep comfortably at night? And I write the figure, I sort of cover my pen and paper and I write down the figure and turn the sheet over. And point blank, 9 times out of 10, they say £100,000. I mean, again, this is a typical client in their 80s that's got multiple hundreds of thousands or a bit more. What amount of money would they sleep comfortably at the bank? And lo and behold, they say 100,000, and I turn over the paper and I show them the 100,000 that I've written. So I've been doing this for some time. So for those clients now, between you and me, 100,000 is possibly a bit too much for an elderly couple. But there's the person where we're dealing with human emotion. While we can say, we're doing the right thing tax-wise and investment-wise, at the end of the day, we're dealing with individuals, and every individual is different, albeit that a lot of older clients say 100,000. I work with my client rather than against them, but it is important also not just to follow the handbook and say you need X amount in the bank, but that they have that level of comfort that they know they can.
Is there a formula? Because especially as youngsters, we look out to the big wide world, or we look out to the people who are 10 years, 20 years, 30 years older than us, building big houses, driving fancy cars, and we kind of it's hard for us to know as youngsters what's normal.
In terms of rainy day
fund,
fund, I'll tell you what the sort of financial handbook is. It's 3 to 6 months net income. That's the official line. Certainly has been historically. In my humble opinion, that's far too low. Again, it's different with each client, and each client knows their income and their expenditure more. And it's just important that we leave clients with adequate rainy day. And
in
funds.
terms of sort of the longevity, in terms of a vision, like what should a youngster or a young person getting out? Where is there a formula, like where his vision should be, or what he wants for himself, or is it kind of it's just too personal and too unique for each case?
Are you talking in terms of what they want to achieve?
In terms of savings, achievements, savings, goals.
Everybody's different. Some people are go-getters and very entrepreneurial and determined to make it, and others are just happy to live comfortably. And it's not my prerogative to argue with that. I'm there to work with whatever their philosophy is, wherever they are on the on the sort of entrepreneurial scale.
It's no secret that getting funding for your property purchase can often be a headache. We've all been there before, awaiting callbacks, chasing for updates, and sometimes even losing out on a deal. But it doesn't have to be that way. Alex Haffner at Fusion Funding has changed the finance experience for investors, private family offices, and landlords across the UK, having successfully funded projects ranging from £500,000 to £20 million and everything in between. Whether you're purchasing a residential block or planning a development project, Alex Haffner is the man you want on your side. Get access to a full-service property finance broker by reaching out to Alex today. Details in the show notes. Question that actually a friend of mine submitted, and it might be a bit out of your own immediate zone, but I love the question and I thought I'd pose it to you because there's a lot of talk of investing. People are always chasing what's the next hype. There's this buzz around it, and people are keen and eager to get onto the investment bandwagon. He had a friend, and this is where the question came from. He had a friend that had saved up a pot of money with the vision to invest it into a buy-to-let. And he found himself in a dead-end job. His employment was he felt very capped, very limited. He'd hit the ceiling and he didn't see a future for himself in his current employment. And now he was stuck at this crossroad. Do I take this money that I've worked hard to set aside and build up this pot? And his goal had always been to invest in a buy-to-let. But now he's got the opportunity to invest inwards, to invest in himself as a person, whether to buy a business, whether to start a business from scratch. The word investing, like, how do you define it? Do we look at ourselves where we are now today and say, I need to invest in myself so that my future can look like this? Or do we say, no, investing is the future and I've got to do what I can now, stay in your job, grind the 9 to 5 and just put aside what you can for the future? Where's the focus? What's the importance?
That's a very personal question. What I would say, though, in the long term, again, I've got clients at different ages. My most successful client, who's an older client, has pots everywhere. He's got substantial amount in pensions, a substantial amount in ISAs, substantial property portfolio. And I think that would be a good example of ultimately the most, and I knew him during the financial crisis 15 years ago. And while a lot of people in property were very, very exposed when, the property market burst and you had the banking crisis in 2008 and 2009, and all the investment banks were falling from grace. He was so diversified that he was able to sort of sit through it all quite comfortably. And I had seen others, not necessarily my clients, but people that I knew of that were so heavily exposed in one area that it was a very, very difficult time for them, which affects them personally.
So you're saying a person's got to look inwards, sort of try and spread yourself.
So original question. It's hard to give one answer, but what a person should be working towards, and I don't know if my answer will address the particular question you've posed, but I'll just take it a bit further. People are most comfortable, I find, when they, gone through their career, gone through their earnings progression, where they've got different assets, very much like in the Talmud. In the Gemara, it says a person should have a third in a land or property, a third in cash, and a third in other assets. And I think I've been doing this for 20. What year? This is originally my father's practice. Clients that are most comfortable, or those clients I find that are most comfortable, are those that have diversified investments. all too often, I meet potential clients and I think to myself, oh, well, it would be nice to have him as a client. Let me go and see him and show them what I can do for them. Oftentimes, potential clients will say, oh no, I only invest in property. I only invest in property. And property has done well, and I'm nobody to argue against that prerogative. But it's vitally important to have things growing alongside your property portfolio and your property assets, no matter how good they are. Because at the same time, as I mentioned earlier on, a big part of what someone like myself can do is not only build up investments for you, but save substantial tax along the way. So for example, for a company director, let's say he has a property, or she has a property portfolio, and they're building up money in their company. I was recently introduced one potential client who wasn't yet my client. He wasn't quite ready, but he said, I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine. This friend has a limited company. He's got, 1.2 million pounds cash sitting there in the business. He hasn't done any pensions for some time, and he's got a big corporation tax bill. Straight away, we were able to use what's called carryback, which allowed him to put in,
3 years.
That's right. Yeah. You can go back. One is able to make contributions up to £60,000 per year.
Per shareholder.
Per individual. And if you have not made any pension contributions in the last 3 years, you can go back. So that's potentially, around £200,000 that you can put in straight away. 3 years ago, the annual allowance was 40,000, so right. You can go. Something of that nature. So this client that I'd met, we put in straight away £200,000 from this 1.2 million cash he had sitting in his business, and that is a deductible. And I sat down with the accountant. I always include, I'm not a lone ranger. I work with my clients, other advisors who he's got sitting alongside him. So I'm not an accountant, I should stress, because a lot of people think I do tax planning. I'm not an accountant. I can't do what accountants do, and I work alongside them. Likewise, accountants, generally speaking, I would say 95% of accountants do not give investment advice, which is my sort of
Which is why I think so many people are kind of lost in this space, because they have the accountants doing their accounts every year. It comes to critical moments like this, and it's kind of, do your research and let us know how you want to proceed, but without some real expert guidance backing
So
that.
in this instance, we sat down with the accountant. I said, right, this is what I propose. I just want to make sure, all the figures are correct, what the client's selling, because sometimes a client may not know all of his sort of vital statistics in terms of his company accounts. I do everything with the accountant, which is so important. And so in this case, the client put in nearly £200,000 into a pension, and that wiped out his corporation tax bill substantially, because that £200,000 is a deductible business expense. Now, for years and years, the client, wasn't doing pensions because for whatever reason, he either didn't have a financial advisor or didn't engage with somebody, or just we're in the long grind. And so we get caught in the groove and we don't take a step back. So this particular client was very grateful to the person that made the introduction. Moving on, now that we've mentioned accountants, perhaps I won't say I'll have a dig at them, because I have a great respect for accountants, and they're a great source of referrals for me, because accountants have a front row seat on their clients' business affairs, and so they are a very good way by which my business grows through referrals from accountants. So I do go and see a lot of accountants. Now, accountants come in great variety of sorts. You have some that are narrow-minded, with the greatest respect to any accountant listening out there, who do their accounts. They'll do a good job for the client, but they are generally historic looking, and the accountants themselves may not necessarily be aware as to the role what a financial advisor can do for their clients. So for example, we put this pension in place for the client's corporation tax bill, which the client was very happy about, and the client was also putting money away for the future. There are other aspects as well. So for example, a big part of what I do, I like to solve problems. So I come across clients that are sitting on large sums of money sitting in their company bank account. Now, in the first instance, no client wants to build up too much money in their business, and accountants are always very proactive to say you're building up too much money in the business, because then that can rock the boat and jeopardize something else known as business relief, which means it might trigger other taxes further down the line. So it is not ideal to have too much money building up in a company. Now, as I mentioned, I like to solve problems. It's a very common problem. And so one of the strategies I put in place for clients is we can put some investment vehicles in place that allow that client or shareholder in their business, typically husband and wife, or it may just be one shareholder, or they may be business partners. I can put investment structures in place that will allow them to take substantial dividends or up to substantial dividends, obviously depending on their cash flow. But if a client has got, let's say, £1 million or £2 million sitting in their company, which I do come across more often than you might imagine, I can put investments in place, again, in conjunction with their accountant, so the accountant is in on the act, so to speak, that will allow those company shareholders or directors, if you like, to take substantial dividends from their business every year, paying zero income tax. It's not a quick fix. It's not a case of, well, let me meet you and then tomorrow you can take a great big...
You've written quite an extensive article on this, haven't you?
That's right. Yeah. Perhaps I give too much away. So I'm sometimes a bit guarded as to how I... But yes, if one digs through the articles, they'll find some of my methods. But again, a case of how can I solve problems? And cash sitting in a company it's a good problem to have. Right. But accountants aren't necessarily aware, and they're not allowed to give investment advice. So some accountants will be very nervous of talking about it. And many of them may not even be aware as to what certain investment vehicles do. So the investment vehicle that I put in place gives clients a very generous level of income tax relief, which we can offset against that dividend. And it's a long-term strategy, but ultimately, and I'll throw some figures out here, hopefully to whet your appetite or any potential company directors out there at the upper end of the scale, obviously where a client has a successful business, with the right structures in place, we can put those clients in a position where, let's say you have a husband and wife company director, where they can take dividends of almost, between the two of them, £400,000 per year, paying practically zero income tax, which when I show it to the accountants, they get very excited and
shows the value of having somebody who specializes in this space and letting them partner with your accountant and put together a vehicle and a process that just works.
Absolutely. And what I would also say is it's not a quick fix. So, you do need to plant the seeds early. Right. And the earlier you start, the earlier one can reap the benefits. Again, it's not a case of meeting me and then tomorrow you can take that great big dividend. Right. It does take a few years to build it up to the most optimum point where they're in a position to do that. But that's just an example where I work alongside accountants. Again, accountants generally don't give investment advice. I don't give accountancy advice. We both sort of work together to help clients. So I meet a great variety of clients. Some are not clued up about what a financial advisor can do for whatever reason. And then you have at the other end of the scale accountants that are very, very, they're always keen to hear the latest ideas and they're keen to make introductions to their client. There was actually a case study that I wrote on LinkedIn, which I think you and I might have discussed briefly before. An accountant introduced a client who was in her 60s. She had sadly lost her husband, so she was now a widow, and she had received some proceeds from his life insurance and his other sort of assets, and she was in a position where she needed income. And also, she wanted a plan to mitigate inheritance tax after her lifetime. And the thing that struck me was, she was sitting she's a very simple lady. I wouldn't say she was extravagant by any means at all. Very humble person and not a big spender. Very sensible person with her feet on the ground. Certainly, from a financial perspective. She was actually in a position where she had £650,000 sitting in her deposit account. All the proceeds of her husband's death benefits from his pension and life insurance that he had. And she was her mindset, she was fraught with worry. Even though she had what to most people would be a reasonable chunk of money. Yeah. Now, she was not a big spender by any means, but she did not know what £650,000 meant. She knew it was a lot of money, but in her mind, this is I think a very important part of how and why a financial advisor is so important for a client, because that amount of money had no meaning to her. She did not know how much she could use of it each year or each month, and she did not know how long it would last. And because of that, she ground to a halt. On top of the fact that she lost her husband and she was in her 60s, her husband was also in his 60s. So, on top of dealing with the personal loss, which is difficult enough, she had this money, but she did not know what it meant. And as a result, she felt that she couldn't spend money because she did not know how long it would last. Now, you might think, well, it's simple maths. If you spend $75,000 a year, the money will last 10 years. If you spend, $37,500 a year, it's going to last 20 years. It's more
how,
than that.
How the money can perform.
It's much more than that. And on top of the fact is she didn't want her children to pay inheritance tax after her lifetime. Yeah. And so, I put different solutions in place that would mitigate inheritance tax after her lifetime. I think we almost ring-fenced all inheritance tax exposure on her estate. But most importantly, from her point of view, we put investments in place where, again, she was not an extravagant person, so she had a very cautious attitude to risk. She'd never really undertaken any investments before. And we put some low-risk investments in place that will give her typically 5 to 6% a year. And the level of withdrawal suited exactly what her financial needs were. She knew exactly what she needed each year to live comfortably. And we were able to show that, look, we're going to put these investments in place. The money's yours. You've got access at all times, even though we are addressing inheritance tax, which will lead me on to another point after I finish this story. But from her point of view, she knew she was getting X amount incoming every month that was enough for her needs. And it just took this veil of worry that disappeared. All of a sudden, she was so relieved that she knew she had the income coming in that she needed, and that the underlying capital would not be exhausted, and that it would last and it would maintain its value.
Meaning what she was using from that money was actual growth, and she was able to perpetual income basically.
That's correct. And that was all consistent with her cautious attitude to risk. So it wasn't the case of me saying, come on, put it all in Bitcoin and you will double your money in 6 months. It wasn't, clearly not. And from my perspective, it was a lot of satisfaction, because I'd met this client. She'd recently lost her husband. She was in a state of turmoil. Again, you might say, well, why is she in turmoil financially? She was, because sometimes we don't know how long something will last, and we don't know what it means. We don't know what to do with it. And I was there to, tick all the boxes.
I think it's a fascinating point about the perpetual income, is that if she's not advised, or a person like that's not advised where to put their money so that it grows with a substantial return, then they're going to start eating into the capital, where essentially that money can be there to perform.
Uncertainty is what cripples people financially. They may have the money, but they can't spend it because they don't know how long it's going to last. Yeah. I found it very telling when this whole story sort of unraveled.
There's a lot of psychology when it comes to money management.
Very much
so. It's everyone's. I mean, this is a question that I was going to ask you later on, but it's going to come in now, because people relate to money the way they were taught to, based on their own upbringings, whatever money meant in their home, from their parents, etc. So their relationship with money is going to be in a certain language. You can have 10 people living next door to each other. Each person is using the same currency, but it's a different language to them. And in your position, you're left trying to decipher how does this person feel, and how can I...
Absolutely. So I'm very much engaging with people's sort of emotional state and where they are. And the interesting thing is, I meet with a client every year and keep in touch with them. And sometimes I speak to her son, because her son is very much looking after his mother in terms of the finances. So he was very much part of the whole process as well. It wasn't a case of me just going to meet her alone. He was part of it. And I often include the client's children 9 times out of 10, certainly for the inheritance tax planning and the older clients. At the last review, we found that even with the level of income we were providing her from her investments, she was building up excess surplus income. It doesn't mean that she wasn't spending, but she was so relieved that I'm getting the income I want. I'm not even spending it all, and I'm still building it. And she was very sort of happy. It wasn't that she wasn't spending it because she felt she couldn't. It was like,
you'd put her in a healthy financial position.
Very.
That's fascinating. I want to jump back into real estate, because it's something which is so prevalent in our community. A lot of people think that is the only vehicle for investing. It's what we grew up with. There's a lot of property within the community, owned, managed, etc. Give us an illustration of what it looks like for a landlord, for an investor who's buying buy-to-lets from a financial perspective. Can you give us some sort of infrastructure in terms of the tax implications when it comes to purchasing? If you've got money in your limited company and you want to purchase a buy-to-let, what's that going to cost you on the ground?
I would say this question is it would be more appropriate to ask an accountant or a tax advisor. I mean, again, there's a fine line between a tax advisor and what I do. An accountant will advise a client whether they're better off owning the properties in a limited company, which seems to be a very popular way of doing things. However, over the years, I've spoken to accountants that have clients who've got portfolios that are built up in their name personally. Having said that, after the client has had their property portfolio set up with through a company to solve those problems, can you take dividends in the case of a limited company? Right. How can we structure dividends so you can take the money out efficiently? How can we reduce your corporation tax bill and siphon money away from the company to put it into a tax efficient structure, for example, a pension to reduce your corporation tax bill?
Right. So there is a lot to learn for property owners who own real estate in the world of tax, and to navigate that and to make it as efficient as possible.
That's right. And also, I would say then, for those clients that are not involved with a limited company, they're owning their property portfolios, let's say husband and wife personally, which has its merits as well, although some might argue not. Again, they will be paying an awful lot of income tax, depending on the size of their portfolio, but they will be attracting income tax on the rental income. There are investments we can put in place to reduce a client's income tax bill.
Okay, so let's jump back into your space then. SIPs and SAS. These are terms that are starting to filter in to people's conversations. Can you briefly just break this down into layman's terms? What does that mean? Let's just use an example of somebody who's got a limited company. He's in his late 20s, early 30s, started a business. That's really who we're trying to centralize this conversation around. What is a SIP? What is a SAS? What's the difference? What do they stand for? What's the difference? And what do we need to know about them?
Okay, before I answer the question, first I'll talk about a personal pension. So an individual is able to set up a personal pension with, you would engage with a financial advisor, or you can even go online and set up your own personal pension yourself. I'll quickly give you a rundown as to the sort of tax reliefs and why it's good to do a pension. One can put in up to £60,000 per year into a pension, and you'll get tax relief on that. There are various other limits depending on your earnings, and that's why you would engage with a financial advisor to make sure you do it correctly. A pension fund builds up until retirement, whenever that might be. Age 55 is the current earliest age. It's changing to 57, that's right. But at some point further down the line, when you decide to pull the plug on that pension, you can then start taking money out. Generally speaking, you're able to take 25% of the fund as tax-free cash, or what's now called a sort of PCLS, pension commencement lump sum, but I'm old-fashioned. I still use the old term tax-free cash. So you can take a quarter of that as tax-free cash. The rest of the fund that's there, you can draw on that fund, but it is fully taxable. So that is how a pension works. And the pension I've described so far is one that you would typically set up either online or with a life insurance company or through a financial advisor. But the funds would be invested in some sort of fund. It might be a Vanguard fund, it might be any other managed fund, but it would be invested perhaps with a life insurance company in their funds. It would be invested in a pension fund. And yes, the answer I think you were about to ask, if one has built up various pension funds with different providers through different employment over the years, yes, you can transfer those pensions and amalgamate them. That's a big part of what I do. And yes, so in the case of a company director, he may choose to have a personal pension, and he can have his company make employer contributions, which is extremely tax efficient from the company's perspective, because any contribution into a pension up to £60,000 a year, and you can do what is known as carryback, as we mentioned earlier on, that is a deductible business expense on the company, which is a very, very valuable benefit for knocking down corporation tax.
Right. So you've got a limited company, a director, let's say a husband-wife setup, they can shelter 120k a year, completely tax-free.
Correct. Okay. That is correct. And that will go into a personal pension, which will be invested in some sort of fund or on some sort of platform. Now, let's take it a little bit further. SIP, self-invested pension plan. That will allow you to, rather than be sort of restricted into the funds that are available on the platform or life insurance company you've invested your pension with, rather than being just restricted to those internal funds, or if you're on a fund platform, this fund supermarket, you can then go and buy other assets. Now, there's a list of what assets are permitted, but the most popular asset to put a pension into is commercial property. Yeah. And if you do want to physically buy you may have your workplace or your, you've got your limited company, and you may rent the property. You rent your workspace or your office. You may rent the building. You can choose to buy that. Right. The only way you're able to buy it through the pension fund, so the pension fund would be buying that property. The only way to do it, you couldn't do it if you had your pension with Aviva or it needs to be a self-invested pension plan. And that will allow you to then invest directly in certain assets. A popular one is commercial property. Now, that's a SIP, self-invested pension plan. The other one is small self-administered scheme, and that is only available to company directors. There's a fine line between what they are, but they're essentially the same, although the rules around them are slightly different. Right. But a SIP is a personal pension where you can buy commercial property and other assets, and a small self-administered scheme is the same thing, but it's exclusively for company directors. Any
difference that's relevant to your typical limited company holder?
That would be a question for a pension trustee, because there is a fine line. SASs are becoming far more common.
Right.
There's a whole sort of legal thing going through at the moment, and some providers of SIPs are withdrawing from the market because clients could potentially sue them. There's a pension trustee that I know very well who's been sort of giving me the inside story on what's going on. So he's a pension trustee. So if you set up a SIP or a SAS, or you signed up for one, you would need to have a pension trustee who's there to dot the I's and cross the T's to ensure that the investments you are making are permitted investments. And there's various other administrative tasks that they need to accomplish as well. But essentially, that's what the SAP and SIP and the SAS is.
Right. So what does that process look like? Can you just break us down the process? Do you go onto a Vanguard website? Where's somebody going if he wants to see more about this, get set up and start making contributions? What does that process look like?
Right. So typically, let's talk about the company directors, where they would set up the SAS, small self-administered scheme, which again, it is a pension. You would need two elements. One is the pension trustee, whom I have good contacts with pension trustees. So by law, they have to be appointed to make sure all the investments are permitted, and they will liaise with HMRC because a SAS is set up in conjunction with HMRC. And then someone like myself would come along as the financial advisor to say, right, you've now set up the SAS. Where are you going to invest the money? So they may not want to invest all of it in commercial property. They may want to have, large variety of investments. And so that's where I would come along to advise on the most appropriate investments. And the same thing would be for the SIP as well. If I would meet a client, then I can set them up in a SIP. A lot of personal pensions now are automatically SIPs anyway. Right. Some may or may not allow you to invest in commercial property, but again, it depends on what the client is looking to do. And I would come along to provide the investment advice and also advise on how much can you put into the pension. So the client I mentioned at the beginning, where the client, we were able to use carry back, and he was able to put in nearly £200,000.
So you are a landlord and you are trying to figure out whether you can or can't evict a tenant from your property. You are also frustrated that it's been 2 months since your tenant paid rent and has since stopped answering your calls. What's really getting to you though is that you've received notice from the council regarding damp and mold issues that need to be dealt with. It's all getting a bit much. And you are beginning to wonder if this investment was really worth the hassle. Well, the good news is that Dovi Feldman at Feldview has built a property management company that does things differently. With over 600 properties being managed impeccably and with Feldview clients rating his service 5-star, you can rest assured that you will have nothing but a positive property investment experience. Fully regulated and covering London and surrounding areas, work with a property management company that just gets it. Enjoy real-time knowledge of current regulations, get your rent paid on time, and know that there is someone at the other end of the line always ready to assist. Reach out to Dovi today, details in the show notes. Investing early, we've touched on this a bit earlier, but I want to get back into it a little bit. I think they attribute it to Albert Einstein, saying that the compound effect is one of the 8 wonders of the world.
Yeah.
Can you take us through how compounding works, why it's important, and why people in their younger years need to really say to themselves, if I want to be somewhere at this age, then this is the time that I need to start giving this intention and focus.
So that's where cash flow modeling will help, which is what I do for clients, where we can project forward and say, right, if you continue with the current status quo, this is what you're likely to have in retirement or further down the line. Whereas if we put investments in place, and it would also take into account the amount of tax we can save along the way where possible, one can see the difference. And typically investments are, the S&P 500 over time has done on average 10% a year, if I'm not mistaken, over the last 20 years. Don't ask me what the FTSE 100 has done, because the figure is far too embarrassing for His Majesty's Treasury. So it is important also to go into the right investments and the right type of funds that are diversified and exposed to the right areas.
But the nature of compounding, what is happening when you get compounded growth?
You get growth on growth. It's not simple interest. So if, for example, you invest and your funds go up 10% in the first year, depending on where you're investing and depending on your attitude to risk, after a year that would be 110. And then the second year you're getting 10% on the 110 and then another 10% on the 110 on the 110.
So the money that's growing for you is growing for you in its own right.
That's right. And the aim is to outpace inflation, whereas leaving funds on deposit, interest rates historically have not kept up with the inflation, and even when interest rates have risen, the amount of interest you'll get on various bank accounts differs a lot. You'll have some providers that will give you a very good rate for a year, and then all of a sudden they'll withdraw those rates.
Yeah. You get penalized by being a client for too long.
Absolutely. I mean, this would be a convenient point to mention. There are, for those clients, for whatever reason, that are sitting on cash, whether it's, let's say, charities or limited companies or trusts, where for whatever reason they're sitting on cash. Something that's really coming to the fore is cash platforms, which I wrote about on LinkedIn. This is my latest article.
My next question for you, Arnold, was what about a person who's got cash in their bank and they're just too scared? A lot of people, they just think the word investment just triggers fear, it triggers uncertainty, it triggers insecurity. And they just want the cash, but at the end of the day, they watching it sitting idle as they watch inflation, as they watch the cost of living go up. They know it needs to do something, but they still want on-demand access for it. What are their options?
I have met so many clients, especially older clients that have built up savings over the years, that have got their funds hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. I met somebody recently that's got almost £1 million in savings and one or two small investments spread over 10 different bank accounts. Right. Which I would never, ever speak against that. And I have the highest respect for those people that have been shrewd and saved money in the bank. Now, that money may have achieved a better return over time if they had invested it. But again, it's not my prerogative to come along to a client and tell them what their attitude to risk should be. And I'm very careful of the sort of boundaries as to...
Must be hard for you sometimes.
Sometimes, but it's not my place to tell a client what attitude to risk they have. If they are cautious and they sleep comfortably at night, and clearly, clients that have built up hundreds of thousands of pounds, if not more, over, 10 bank accounts, they haven't done so badly. Yeah. Administratively, that is a nightmare. For those clients that want to hold cash and they're always looking for the best rates, it is an administrative nightmare these days to open many bank accounts. It's just so difficult. You've got a proof of ID or proof of residence, etc., and it's just not an easy thing. And rates change all the time. Nowadays, I'm introducing clients to cash platforms where it's quite simple. You have one login, it's all administered online, and you can disperse your funds over, I think, one cash platform that I'm dealing with, that I'm introducing to clients, access to 45 different UK bank accounts on one simple login. So that client can shop around. Once they've put their money onto the platform, they've got access to 45 different UK banks, and they can see who's offering the best rates and what terms. Some accounts will give instant access. Some accounts will be, 3 months notice, or some will have a fixed date. But the client is then spoilt for choice. And importantly, and this is very important, under the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, if a bank goes under, one is protected up to £85,000.
So in this case, they'll get coverage.
Platform, as long as their exposure to any one institution or any one bank is 85,000 or less, they are fully covered if that individual bank would go under, which is thought to be unlikely, but nevertheless one should be aware as to what the protections exist.
So just to clarify, so for each account that the money's in, for each bank their money's with, they've got the full 85k coverage.
That is correct. Per bank. That is correct. So for example, if a client put in £850,000 onto the platform and split it across 10 banks, so his full 850, but the sort of novelty there is it's very easy to administer. It's one login.
And it's just giving that bird's eye view of what's available for you, and just making that
and they can shop around. So 3
months
months time, when their account the rate comes down or matures, or they can then move it to another account.
Right. So they can still
it's
get
all
access
under
to
one
cash
login.
And
Absolutely. And they can remit funds back to their own personal bank account at any time, depending on the terms of whatever they've. And the interesting thing is, if you compare putting your money across 10 bank accounts to physically opening 10 bank accounts and all the statements that come through, and it's an administrative nightmare, and call centers, and it's just nothing but headaches. So we're very fortunate we live in an age where these things exist. Now one might say, well, doesn't that defeat the point? Because generally I would advise against holding too much cash on deposit. And while that may be the case, again, we're dealing with emotions, we're dealing with people, and different people have different comfort zones. And it could be, for example, a charity where the rules and guidelines that the trustees have provided say that we don't want to take risk, or we want to hold X amount in cash. So this is ideal for those type of setups.
Amazing. What's the benchmark for a person to engage with an investment advisor? He's worked on his savings, he's building up a small kitty. At what point does he have to look at his account and say, I need help from somebody professional in this space, or I should just try and wing it myself?
Before I answer that question with a sort of specific figure, which I'll try not to give for various reasons, it's very interesting. I would say it's important to engage with somebody, because these days it's all too fashionable to buy Bitcoin or to buy any sort of fund that's doing well, technology funds, AI funds and things like that. And it's all fine and dandy when things go up spectacularly. Everyone thinks they're the best investor. since Warren Buffett, and understandably so. Look, my money's gone up so well, I'm doing so well. Anyone can make money in a bull market. But the interesting thing is what happens when it starts to turn south, because that's when we are emotionally connected to our money and our decisions. And all too often over the years, I've seen people who've looked after their own investments directly and not engaged with a professional. And they may have made money when it was going up, but then as soon as it started, going down, they sold at the wrong time. They sold after it had dropped, and then it started going up again, and then they bought in again. You're going to and fro with the market, but at completely the wrong time. Yeah. It's so easy to do that with your own money. It's completely the wrong thing to do. One should be investing for the long term in the right type of funds. And like Warren Buffett said, you have to buy when others are fearful and be fearful when others are buying. Yeah. But it's so easy to fall into that mistake. Now, as professional financial advisors, we take the emotion out of that, and we're able to say to our client to steer the course. Don't get caught up in the short-term movements. Now, one may want to have a flutter and buy and sell and trade a bit. And again, that's not my prerogative to say no, don't do that. But what I would say is do that with a smaller portion of your portfolio, right? Because if you get it wrong, the consequences can be a very expensive lesson. Whereas if the majority of your funds you are engaging with an investment professional, long-term financial advisor, I've got an article on there that's time-stamped during COVID. Right. Which is very, very telling as to what happened in the market. I wrote an article March 2020, about a week before the bottom, and I said it's so important to stay the course and not get caught up by these short-term drops, because typically we find wherever the market drops suddenly out of nowhere, it comes roaring back. Oh. And I've spoken to friends and other people who manage their own, investments.
I think on the Vanguard website, they've got a graph where they show that the highest performing days were always closest
to the biggest drops, and you're losing out, and it is so critical. I know of horror stories where they did the wrong thing because they were managing their own funds, and the emotions.
There's so much emotion at play.
The emotion takes over you. This market drop is historically wherever we had the market drop suddenly out of nowhere without warning, or very, very quickly, that typically means the market will come roaring back quite quickly.
And you want to be in it when it happens.
And the last thing you want to do is pull the plug at the wrong time, because you would be down 20% already, for example, and you'll miss. And you may never be able to recover your funds. It will take a long, long time.
Is what we see on the market, when we see the drops or the rises, is that real time, or is that sort of like a ripple effect of what's happened already a short while ago?
Ooh, stock markets are forward-looking. So you'll find that stock markets typically will bottom 6 to 9 months before the actual economy, before Joe Bloggs on the street will start to feel the effect of an economic recovery. So stock markets are very much forward-looking.
So what does that mean? That when a person should not react when they see something happening?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just answering your question now, and then I'll go back to the original point that I wanted to talk about. So, for example, March 2009 was the bottom of the equity, the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. The bottom of the stock market was March the 9th, 2009. However, the economy didn't start to improve. There wasn't positive GDP growth until I think it was, early 2010. Right. But the stock market told you that the economy will turn. But for investors, the time, ultimately, the golden opportunity is to buy at the bottom of, going back to sort of when COVID struck, and I wrote this article, I said, when the market suddenly falls, it will typically come back. And the worst thing to do is and that's why if you are engaging with a financial professional, I was able to guide clients and say, just stay
the course. So you're more of a psychologist than
in a certain sense, yes, we do have that hat to. Now, having said that, in the article I also mentioned, in the 2008 crisis, one would have been very sensible to move out of the market. So you could say, well, then where's the argument there? Now, that was brewing. The real drops in the market when Bear Stearns fell and all the other banks were falling from grace, that was brewing for, the markets had already topped out October 2007. And so it wasn't it was a very slow grind lower.
The flags were there.
Yeah, the flags were there. And so, a lot of clients did. So there are certain times where there are merits, but then you need to muster and so it can be very difficult. So there were differences in the COVID drop, and again, we'll hopefully point out to those articles.
I want to touch briefly before we get towards closing on just inheritance tax planning. We've spoken a lot about investing, property, stocks, etc. But inheritance tax planning is I think the former Labour Chancellor Roy Jenkins famously described inheritance tax. I just love this line.
Very famously.
As a voluntary,
It's a voluntary levy paid by those who distrust their heirs
more than they dislike the inland revenue, which I think is a fantastic line. Do you find that generally people are reluctant to deal with their inheritance tax planning? Is it something that they just don't want to think about and you've got to kind of get around them to get them into the conversation? Are people generally happy to engage? Like, what's the general...
Very interesting question. So typically, yes, none of us like to think about our mortality. And typically, it's the children that if I say selling to, I'm selling these ideas. I'm trying to strike a chord with the children, because oftentimes the adult children will raise this, especially with an elderly parent. And so that's the sort of way in from my perspective. But again, people have different views on this. I have some clients where the parents themselves are driving the inheritance tax planning, and others where it's the children driving it. But oftentimes I will have both parents and children in the room to discuss what options are available. And we are very fortunate to live in an age where, more so than ever before, we can, from an inheritance tax planning point of view, one can have their cake and eat it. Historically, one has always believed, or people generally believe, that, if I've got to plan for inheritance tax, I've got to gift away my assets and live 7 years. Yeah. While there is truth to that, there are investment vehicles these days where you can have your cake and eat it, where money or investments can stay in your name, in your ownership. You can have access at any time. And I have a great number of clients in this vehicle where they're taking, monthly withdrawals for income in retirement. But once they have owned these investments beyond the 2-year point, it is free of inheritance tax, which, again, you don't need to gift away or give up funds. The money's yours. You can have access. Now, if we were having this conversation before October the 30th, right, I would say there is no upper limit in such investments. However,
our good friend,
the Chancellor, imposed a limit on such investments per person. Well, you get 100% relief from inheritance tax on the first £1 million that's put into such vehicles. That's per person. So you can have a husband and wife, and they can shelter £2 million from inheritance tax as long as they've owned these investments for at least 2 years or more. The idea is you hold this investment for the rest of your life, but you've got full access at all times. As I say, I have a great number of clients taking regular withdrawals, or they can take big chunks out, if they need funds for anything. But while it's in there beyond the 2-year point, or whatever is held at the point of their demise, it's the first £1 million per person is free of inheritance tax. Beyond that, the relief is 50%. So if an individual would hold in excess of £1 million, the first £1 million would be free of inheritance tax. The residue above that in these investments would still benefit from a 50% discount on the inheritance tax bill. So instead of their children paying 40%, it would be 20%, which is still nevertheless a saving. I should point out that this is known as business relief. These reliefs are in addition to the nil rate band, and where relevant, the residence nil rate band. So where I think it's a good opportunity to talk about the allowances, typically a married couple ordinarily will have a joint inheritance tax allowance of $650,000. There is an additional allowance known as the residence nil rate band, which will be an extra $350 on their own home, providing they are leaving their home to their children, to the next generation, and providing their joint estate is not valued in excess of $2 million. Once an estate goes above $2 million, then you start to lose that extra $350,000 relief on the residence nil rate band.
Which will be happening quicker now with pension funds being
absolutely
part of the
estate. Yeah, very much so.
They're playing a smart game over here.
But I still firmly believe that these business relief investments, which allow £1 million each free of inheritance tax, in addition to the nil rate bands, is an extremely generous benefit. Now, I know business relief is actually related to businesses, although
it's not
they are available from my perspective, they are available, and from a client's perspective, they are available as retail investments that I would advise a client to. I do advise clients on, and we can spread them around various providers. So they are retail investments. But the original idea behind business relief was to allow family businesses to be passed down to the next generation, especially farms, because there was or there still is something known as agricultural property relief. And I don't know if you were in central London yesterday, but you may have been caught by various protests headed by certain Jeremy Clarkson and a lot of opposition MPs there. I know Nigel Farage was there. The farmers were up in arms because the business relief allowances of £1 million. Well, farmland typically, it's land, it's worth a lot more. You have these farmers that after their lifetime, well, then the children will inherit these farms. And the first $1 million, as we said, is free of inheritance tax, but the land may be worth, let's say, $2 or $3 million. Well, where on earth are they going to get the funds to pay the 20% tax? Remember the relief on anything in excess of it. And they're not selling the asset. And so this is the reason for the farming industry, especially being up in arms. But I should add, it's not just farming, and these are the same consequences for anyone who owns a business that's valued at more than £1 million. Right.
And they might be in the same position if there's no cash in the business to come up with that cash.
Or if it's a property, property companies never got this relief in the first place, so it's not so relevant. But a trading business, if somebody's got a trading business that's worth multiple millions,
fascinating. Arnold, it's been really amazing and eye-opening to hear all these different concepts that you've helped break down and clarify. As we get towards closing, most of the audience listening to this podcast are sort of young business owners, male, female, finding their footing in the big wide world and still keen to learn more about this topic. What resources can you share? Where can we go? Where can we view, read, listen more about this, different things? What can you? Where can
I'm
you
going to be
guide us?
biased here. I would duly direct the listener to my LinkedIn page, to my article bank, where I've got nearly 40 or 50 articles,
that's
which I hope, these are ideas that one wouldn't have necessarily seen elsewhere.
So you're taking these big concepts, breaking them down for us to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I set out to solve problems. And so the creativity with which I approach, we live in a very generous financial planning world. The landscape allows one to make investments that will save a lot of tax. Aside from the fact that we're, building up funds using compounded. And so I've approached things trying to solve problems that others, for whatever reason, just have not come up with. And everything I do is regulated and it's all under FCA protection. I would direct the reader just to sort of
get familiar with the concepts.
As you yourself mentioned, some of my articles are unknown. I'm blatantly biased, of course.
But please steal the show. Amazing. Arnold, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to come and chat and talk about these things. Like I said, the reasoning for what I'm doing with this podcast is to really give a platform for young business owners to understand and to learn more about things that we're not taught in school, and to teach them fundamentals and to express fundamentals. And people like yourself will take time to prepare, to come, sit down, record. You're really giving to so many people, and for that I thank you. Well, friends, I hope you found value in this conversation. If you want to open your mind to more of these ideas and understand further about tax-efficient investment vehicles, or perhaps are looking to plan your estate wisely, feel free to check out some of the resources listed in the show notes below. Thank you once again to Dovi Feldman and Alex Haffner for supporting this podcast, and to Maxim Cohen at the Jewish Lending Institute. We truly appreciate your support. Until next time.